serious threat to the health of the communities. And I'll come back maybe to some of the short-term solutions that have been found so far. It is also important to say that because of the pollution, many fishermen are finding it difficult to now catch fish, and they have to go further and further to get it. And some of the fish farms that you will see maybe some pictures of later on are of no use anymore because people cannot catch fish there. The quality of the fish caught in the area is also tainted, but more difficult is that the fish basically has migrated from the polluted areas, so the fishermen have to go longer distances to find them. Here's some illustrations, as you can see everywhere. These are the situations where the fishermen have to live, and some of the difficult situations you have there. It's really unbearable to look at these images. The wetlands, of course, supporting fishing activities, and this is essentially for the fishing community. They are quite present in that region. As for the mangroves and other ecosystem services, they serve the entire community, not only one sector, but actually the entire community there. Again, maybe a little bit of difference with the Gulf of Mexico here, which is in a region which is much more developed. We are dealing here with communities that are totally dependent on natural resources, and whose foundation, whose capital has been polluted. So one of the unfortunate situations here is that communities, at least from the comments I have heard, feel that they are just unfortunate to be born in a place that is rich in oil. That's basically the situation. Again, you have a lot of leaks coming from the pipelines, and there is an inadequate management and supervision to ensure that the pollution is maintained. We'll come back to institutional issues that are also part of the problem there. One of the observations by the team, which you cannot see just from the ground, but you basically sometimes have to fly to see it, is that there is an explosion of artisanal refineries in Nigeria that are undertaken by local communities. Essentially from 2009, there have been sort of very entrepreneurial undertakings by the local communities to refine the oil, which is extremely dangerous for their health, extremely dangerous for the environment. As you can see, the consequences on the environment are just terrible on the mangroves. Another picture, just to illustrate what I was saying. And unfortunately, it is just growing as we speak. Every year, every month, there are new developments. And this is actually feeding into a whole system in the country that is very difficult to control, and is probably closer to a mafia than anything you can describe. So that is also a situation that the government will have to address. Some of the challenges, there are many challenges, but some of the challenges are legal. Again, there is a conflict of interest there because there's a legislation that is controlled by a department that is not independent from the oil industry in terms of institution. So it is one of the recommendations of the report was that the oversight should be given to another body, essentially, that is sitting under the Ministry of Environment, not under the Ministry of Petroleum. The institutions that are tasked with managing the oil industry have low capacity, and unfortunately, there is a national institution called Nostra which has no capacity, and sometimes is relying on the oil industry to perform its job, which again is something that normally should not happen. The resilience, talking about it, of the environmental system has been surpassed. The stretch that you show from Wes's presentation, that elastic band, I think in the case of Nigeria, was surpassed many years ago, at least in many places. The community's own resilience is also adversely affected by degradation. So we are talking about something that has been going on for many decades, and therefore has severe consequences on the environment and on communities. One of the major recommendations of the report is to do a cleanup, a proper real cleanup of the whole region, and to put in place a national institution for the cleanup with an initial lifespan of 10 years, but maybe it should be expanded for longer. We thought that the cleanup would take decades, at a minimum 3 decades, and that the government should be putting in place funds together with the oil industry, paid for by the oil industry and the government. An initial investment of $1 billion will be needed to clean up the Ogoni land, only the Ogoni land. I'm not talking about the Delta. Again, let me clarify that. Even though the Ogoni land is in the Niger Delta, but the Niger Delta is much wider than the Ogoni land, which is just a portion of it. And that both local and international civil society need to continue to be vigilant and need to contribute as well from the technical point of view and from their expertise. Everybody has to play a role. Now, what is a challenge now in Nigeria can be transformed into an opportunity in the sense that that cleanup will be probably the single most largest cleanup operation in the world that would have been undertaken, and that they can build their capacities there from the Ogoni land, maybe expand the capacities to the Niger Delta as a whole, and maybe expand that to other parts of the world. I think I'll stop there, and maybe with the dialogue and discussions we can.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That was a very good presentation. The Niger Delta case is one of those from which a great many lessons can be learned, provided people are willing to sit down and talk to each other and learn them. One of the problems with the Niger case is that it's been riven by conflict. People are pointing finger and playing the blame game. That's not going to get us anywhere. Are there any questions? That blame game is part of the rigidity traps that these systems get into. It's bad news. Yes.
Yes, I'm Saeed Damouriya from Jordan, part of the Commission for System Management. Probably just a comment regarding both cases in Nigeria and in the Gulf of Mexico. I believe it's our greedy needs that took us to that particular position when we, especially the case in Gulf of Mexico, went into the sea deeper and deeper and deeper. That will create eventually the new pattern of pollution that you talked about, where most of the pollutants remain way deep low in the deep sea because of the difference in salinity and temperature, etc. Regardless of the resilience of the ecosystem, the problems that we are creating are way beyond the capability of any ecosystem to bounce back. Then, okay, we say companies or industry in general, they are putting back money in order to help them clean up or doing research, etc., etc. But again, they are doing or getting more profit than they are.
Sorry, can I cut you off there?
Yeah.
A question directly to the speaker, not a presentation of your own, please.
No, it's not a presentation.
Question.
Question is, again, under these situations where we have underdeveloped countries or trying to develop countries with this kind of greedy companies that are going into these areas, for example, in the middle of Africa or even some areas in Asia, that will create major problems. Are there any policies or any regulations that control the relationship between these companies and the government in these areas? Thank you.
Of course, you are dealing with a situation in a given country, and that country has the sovereignty of managing their situation. In this particular case, I think what we can say is that the government of Nigeria has signed contracts with companies to exploit resources that are in that country, and that there is a failure in the system. There's a failure in the system, and challenge now is to see how this can be corrected. What I would also like to clarify is that this region is now just trying to deal with the legacy. There is no oil exploitation anymore. What they want, the last thing they want to do is to see that as communities. But I think as government and as international community, what we have to focus on now is to see how this can be corrected.
All right, one question from the back, and how are we doing for time, Charlotte?
Well, we need to move on. We'll have
One
we'll
question?
have
Okay.
a lot more time for questions.
One more short question. and then
It's a
we'll-
short question. Okay, Daniel Foley, I'm Green Vice Chair of the Royal Commission on Protected Areas, and I'm a member of the independent panel on the Niger Delta, which has just been set up. I'm a practical guy, okay? So if there was one or two things that are practical that we could do based on your experience in Nagonaland, what would you be recommending at a very practical level to even take small steps to resolve what is a very long-term issue and improve the situation for local communities and the industry alike?
You mean as international community?
What would have the greatest effect in terms, at a practical scale, of improving the situation? One or two practical things.
Two things. One is to sit down and talk and create that environment of trust. Then we can work together, all of us, the community, oil industry, the government, and the civil society in general, including the international civil society, which is also playing a very important role there. Number two is to start the cleanup now.
So start.
Clean up now,
Yeah.
while stopping the ongoing pollution.
Right. Thanks very much. Next speaker is going to be Kath Wallace from New Zealand.
Excuse me, I'll just introduce myself while the presentation comes up. I'm here representing for the Congress, the Environment and Conservation Organisations of New Zealand. But I also teach environmental economics and policy at Victoria University of Wellington, but I'm not here in that capacity. I guess what I'm going to talk about is a situation which was, compared to what we've heard about in the Gulf and in Ogoniland, a very significantly small event, which also leads us, though, to a much wider kind of question for New Zealand. Tell me, how do I advance?
Click the left button.
Okay, just for those of you who are not aware of where New Zealand is, it's about 12 hours flight south of here, and it's the next stop south of New Zealand is Antarctica. We're essentially a very big underwater continent, and there's a significant amount of interest, or the government is embarking on a very strongly economic growth focused policy, very much extractivist economic growth. We already have some oil exploration activity and production activity here, but there are other basins that the government considers should be explored and has embarked on a very aggressive campaign to expand oil and gas production in New Zealand as a centrepiece. Sorry, how do I do that without that coming up? But anyway, I just want to acknowledge Charlotte and the rest of the panellists and the Resilience Alliance and all the people who worked to protect that environment. Does this
Just click it. Just left click.
left click? Sorry. Okay. Now the Rena was just a cargo vessel that ran aground on rocks because the crew took some shortcuts to get to a port at a time that they wanted to. It was relatively close inshore, and in a sense it wasn't a systems problem, but what it did was to generate awareness that there was a systems problem in the response, and it also generated a conversation about the overall political objective of our government and its extractivist economic growth policy. The actual amount of tonnage of oil was quite small compared to what we've heard discussed just now. These are the stats for what was cleaned up and what wasn't. But because it was a cargo ship, we also had a lot of other debris, including particularly little packets of noodles and the condiments that looked very much like fish and were probably eaten by marine creatures, and also these tiny little plastic beads which were for manufacturing plastic, and they ended up washed all over the coast for miles around. It was a very substantial amount of pollution, and it's continuing. When the Rena went aground and we had the oil spills and also containers floating about, we had a number of, this was the reef, we had a number of exclusion zones, and this affected both the Maori community that lived and depends on some of the reef areas, and it also affected a number of tourism and other operations, fishing and so on. We have the question of what are we talking about in terms of the resilience. The environment, certainly, I'm an economist, not an ecologist, so I won't really talk about that, but there are people studying it, as you might expect. One of the issues, though, was the resilience of the government's economic growth strategy, and it also showed up lack of resilience in New Zealand's legal and policy regime, and had some implications for New Zealand's reputation. You can see here the question of civil society and New Zealand's oil spill response, and some of the interactions and community effects. We have an industry and cabinet that is particularly pushing to get access, and one of the things you need to understand about New Zealand's regulatory regime is that we did not have, when the Rena went aground, we did not have any regime for managing oil spills and the environmental side of oil and gas beyond 12 nautical miles out into the EEZ and beyond. So there were particular concerns about this, and it was also taking place in the context of government budget cuts and a certain degree of turf protection. So this question of how can we respond well given these sorts of situations and high public concern and Maori concern now about the government's oil and gas strategy. So it was a trigger event that then has triggered a whole lot of system responses that take us on to critiquing the government policy. We were already pushing as environmental groups for much better policy, and there has been some policy development, but that had got stalled. Since this vessel went aground in 2011, the government has introduced and passed legislation just last week that does put in place some degree of a system for processing, but it's significantly flawed. And just in terms of that governance regime, we have a good integrated piece of law for managing terrestrial and out to 12 nautical mile environmental management, but nothing beyond that. And our oil spill response was really geared at just spills in a harbour. The fact that the main agency that has responsibility for coordination had that responsibility, but neither the resources nor being in charge of the policies, has meant that that's shown up a systems problem within the governance arrangements. Maritime New Zealand's own response operating model is that they will do this, but when they came to this situation, they only had about 15 people trying to manage this and coordinate a whole lot of other agencies. The New Zealand system, sorry, I seem to have lost a bit of text here. Anyway, we have a range of agencies that are dealing with the international dimension, and dealing with the domestic policy and dimension, but it was only this lower part that we had Maritime New Zealand in control. They do everything from small, here we go, from small craft safety to dealing with these situations of large craft that go aground or, they're trying to avoid going aground. The environmental impacts are being studied. We know that there were significant numbers of dead birds. We don't know nearly as much about the fish and invertebrates or the marine mammals. And some of the very significantly endangered species were involved, and some of them were protected, others died. We had a huge public response from civil society, which basically got very impatient with government delays in mobilising responses. Some of the public put themselves at risk, but they were particularly focused on cleaning up the beaches, removing oil, and focusing on the impacts of wildlife. Trying to clean up animals, particularly these little blue penguins, the dotterels, the very endangered dotterels, and a whole lot of other species.